Chapter 8. Review of the Argument. Now if water be the best, and gold be the most precious, so now to the farthest bound doth thereon by his fair deeds attain, and from his own home touch the pillars of Heracles. Pathless the things beyond, pathless alike to the unwise and the wise. Here will I search no more, the quest were vain. Pindar. In part second, at the very beginning of our discussion, attention was called to the two classes of tests which the hypothesis of an Arctic polar site for Eden must necessarily meet. First, the tests which would apply alike to all the ordinarily proposed sites in temperate and intertropical latitudes, and second, the tests which would be inseparable from the aspects and judgments of nature at the pole. In the first class, 7 were enumerated, and at the close of part 4th we saw how surprisingly and convincingly all of the 7 had been met. In the second class, 7 others were particularized as new features, introduced into the problem of the site of Eden by the very nature of our hypothesis. They were all of so peculiar and extraordinary a character, and they so modified the requirements to be made of all corroborative human tradition, that nothing short of the truth of the intrinsically improbable hypothesis could save it from obvious and ridiculous failure at each successive point. In the present part we have now brought together the facts, or at least a portion of the facts, which go to demonstrate that the hypothesis of a polar paradise, and no other, can meet and satisfy each one of these new and more difficult requirements. Speaking after the manner of the mathematicians, though of course with due remembrance of the nature of the reasoning employed, it may be said that we have first solved our problem, and then, by a new process and with changed elements, proved and verified our answer. Whoever would see how strikingly complete and cogent this verifying process is, should turn back to the second chapter of part 2nd, and carefully collate the 7 new features there enumerated with the facts of the first 7 chapters of the present part. The result of such a collation upon any candid mind can hardly be doubtful. In the writer's firm-grounded conviction, then, lost Eden is found. To no one of his readers can its true site be more surprising than it was at first to him. Every antecedent probability seemed to array against it. First of all, in such problems, every new hypothesis is inherently unlikely in this direct proportion to the number of hypotheses previously propounded and found wanting. Where had been more advanced by the learned and ingenious than here? Again, from its nature, the hypothesis has greatly aggravated the conditions and requirements of the problem itself. And if, during centuries of discussion, no sublunary site had been found which could meet the simple conditions of Genesis, how unlikely that, with new and far more extraordinary conditions added a place could be found corresponding. Again, in order to its verification, the hypothesis required that a wholly new interpretation of mankind's oldest cosmological ideas and traditions should be propounded and verified. An interpretation unanimously forbidden by the consensus of modern scholarship in almost every department of historical and archaeological research. How supremely unlikely that any such undertaking could be crowned with success. Happily, human events do not fall out according to our short-sighted human likelihoods. Even the thoughtless man sees it and exclaims, "It is always the impossible that happens." The more reverent soul, who discerns in all history a higher than human agency, and in whose eyes nature itself is supernatural, must least of all be daunted by the unpromising first appearances of any clue to truth. His conceptions of the actual are larger than those of mere believers in nature, and there too are adjusted his conceptions of the probable. Identifying himself with that personal power which everywhere makes for truth no less than for righteousness, he is ever expecting the otherwise unexpectable, and for the same reason ever looking upon each new truth attained, not as a personal achievement, but simply as one more proof and precious pledge of peoplehood. In the progress of the studies here summed up, many curious things have come to light, one of which may apparently be mentioned in this place. Archaeologists are well aware that more than 100 years ago, in his Lettres sur l'Atlantide de Plantin, 1779, and Lettres sur l'origine des sciences, 1777, the learned and ingenious Jean-Sylvain Bailly advocated the view that the primitive cradle of civilization was in Siberia, under the 49th or 50th degree of latitude. In the latter of the works named, there occurs a noteworthy passage in which the author, rhetorically fixing the birthplace of mankind at the very pole, remarks upon the singular conformity of such a starting point, both with all the phenomena of civilization and with the indications of mythology. In the same breath, however, as if startled by his own temerity, he reassures his readers by announcing that his suggestion is only a philosophic fiction, and that it lacks the support of history. Is it too much to say that the support of history has now been furnished? Though our hypothesis needs no further confirmation, it would be perfectly easy to develop a new and striking line of evidence from the light which it throws on the origin of the erroneous preconceptions which in the past have either perpetually suggested false theories, or else occasioned the conviction that the problem was insoluble. Thus, after what we have learned as to the posture of worshippers in all ancient nations, it is easy to understand that the primitive garden in the front country must have been in the north. But since in the post-glacial ages this front country was naturally associated with the east, and all investigators, Jewish, Christian, and Mohammedan, were trying to find some oriental region of paradisic climate with a central tree and a quadrifurcate river by which the primitive Gan Eden might be identified, we have in this preliminary misconception reason enough for their failure age after age. Again, in reviewing the results of the theologians, we saw that not a few of the more modern had, like Luther, been repelled and disgusted by the apparently senseless and contradictory representations of the earlier fathers of church teachers, in some of which paradise was placed in heaven, and yet apparently on earth, and anon perhaps midway between heaven and earth, as high, in fact, as the moon. In view of such representations, we cannot be surprised that a keen-witted satirist like Samuel Butler, in enumerating the rare accomplishments of Hudibras, should have said, "He knew the seat of paradise, could tell in what degree it lies, and, as he was disposed, could prove it below the moon, or else above it." Our study of the prehistoric Paradise Mountain, standing upon the earth at the Arctic Pole and lifting its head to the orbit of the moon, brings instant light to all this confusion. The mountain is at once in heaven and on earth, and it is interesting to note that the late medieval theologians, despite their meager opportunities for historical research, trace this conception to just that apostle, according to the ecclesiastical tradition, as special apostle of India, had best opportunity to learn of the East Aryan Meru, and to report this peculiar and venerable tradition of paradise. Moreover, as we have seen, there were in several Asiatic religions two paradises, a celestial and a terrestrial, connected by a pillar, or bridge, up and down which holy souls could pass. When, therefore, an ancient writer is found alluding in one place to paradises on earth, and in another to paradises in heaven, the confusion is not in his own mind, but merely in that of the reader. Here, too, a good word can be put in for poor Cosmas Incoplustes, the man who has had the honor of being more ignorantly and contemptuously abused by modern scientists than any other cosmographer of early Christian ages. Doubtless it is easy to ridicule his rude representation of the universe, but who will assure us that, 13 or 14 centuries hence, it may not be equally easy to ridicule the speculations of Herschel as to the form of the cosmic whole? However this may be, the foregoing chapters have given a new significance to the thought of the monk who sailed to India, showing us that his mountain to the north of the known countries of his day was none other than Mount Meru, the legendary heaven-supporting culmination of the northern hemisphere. His location of Eden, so far as the verdict of science is yet rendered, is at least as well supported as Haeckel's in Lost Lemuria, or Unger's in A Mid-Atlantic Atlantis. Most remarkable of all, just north of the Arctic Ocean boundary of Europe, not the West, as sometimes falsely represented, he locates the land where man dwelt before the flood. If our conclusions are correct, Cosmas was the earliest known geographer who gave to the Christian world a true account of the original seat of the post-Edenic antediluvian world. Thus, those who have so long made him their pet illustration of the ignorance and unscientific spirit of Christian teaching may yet see occasion to revise their judgment, and to transform a portion of their ridicule into praise. The same principles which explain the strange world of Cosmas explain also the strange conception of the earth which we found in the letters of Columbus. According to this letter, it will be remembered, the historic hemisphere was true to the spherical figure, but the hemisphere of his far west explorations rose to a lofty eminence at the equator, in what he supposed to be Asia, but which afterwards proved to be the northern part of South America. This gave to the earth the figure shown in the adjoining cut, a figure which he compared to that of a nearly round pear. At first view, this conception seems altogether arbitrary and even whimsical. But if we go back a century or two to Dante's Earth, we find a globe still more eccentric, one on which the Paradise Mount has slipped down full 30 degrees below the equator, and shown in the following figure. A fundamental datum for its construction is found in the description of the mountain of Purgatory, respecting whose location it is said, Zion stands with this mountain in such wise on the earth that both have a single horizon and diverse hemispheres. A commentator on this says, when the Divina Commedia was written, Jerusalem was believed to be the exact center of the habitable hemisphere. The other was conceived to be covered with water. Out of this ocean the mountain of the poet's Purgatory rises up, like the peak of Tenerife, from the bosom of the waves, and is exactly opposite to Mount Zion, so that the two become the antipodes of each other. The mathematicians, in their measurement of Dante's hell, proceeded in this wise. An arc of 30 degrees was measured from the meridian of Jerusalem westward as far as Cuma, near Naples, and here, at the Fosses Averni, or Virgil, it pleased them to locate its dreary entrance. Another arc of 30 degrees was next measured from the same meridian eastward, so that both together made up a portion of the Earth's circumference of about 4,330 English miles, the chord of which would be equal to its semi-diameter. This was made the base of their operations, so that with the world's center for its apex, the inferno as broad as it was deep. At this center of gravity, firmly wedged in everlasting ice, the grim monarch of these dolorous realms is placed. A more recent editor remarks, Dante's Purgatory is figured as an island mountain whose summit just reaches to the first of the celestial spheres, that of the moon. It is exactly at the antipodes of Jerusalem, and its bulk is precisely equal and opposite to the cavity of hell. On the summit of the mountain is the earthly paradise, formerly the Garden of Eden. Upon the correctness of the mathematicians above mentioned, the present writer is not prepared to pass judgment, but no careful reader of the Divine Comedy can fail to see that its Mount Zion and the purgatorial Montagna Malagovle, Altissima et Cinta do Mare are simply unrecognized survivals of prehistoric thought. Antipodal world mountains once situated at the poles, but here relocated to suit the demands of sacred medieval cosmology. They are the Sumeru and Kumaru of India figuring in Christian poetry. In Lord Vernon's illustration of this curious cosmos, a Hindu pundit would almost certainly think he had a Puranic Mappamondi. That after the Paradise Mount has thus declined, first to the latitude of Central Asia, then to the equator, and finally to the pendant position in which Lord Vernon places it, directly under the City of God, with a hypogene central inferno between. That after such translocations it should so long have eluded the recognition of all paradise seekers is surely little wonder. Our Arctic Eden, by explaining the origin of the cosmological conceptions of ancient Chaldea and Egypt and India, explains at the same time the origin of the most eccentric and apparently senseless conceptions of medieval and modern cosmographers, and presents what may properly enough be called the philosophy of the errors and misconceptions and fancies of previous searchers after paradise. It is much that a hypothesis meets all the requirements of a given problem. It is more that it does this better than any other hypothesis. It would seem to be past all question when it so illuminates and enriches the very data of the problem that every previous solution falls away of itself, the philosophy of its origin and of its inadequacy being patent and unquestionable. Part 6. The significance of our results. But as one lights a candle to look for one or two things which they may want, the light will not confine itself to those two objects. So methinks, in seeing after these two, the universal deluge in paradise, and in retrieving the notion and doctrine of the primeval earth upon which they depended, we have cast a light upon all antiquity. Thomas Burnet. I have laid it down as an invariable maxim constantly to follow historical tradition, and to hold fast by that clue, even when many things appear strange and almost inexplicable, or at least enigmatical. For in the investigation of ancient history, the moment we let slip the thread of Adrieu, we can find no outlet from the labyrinth of fanciful theories and the chaos of clashing opinions. F. von Schlegel, Philosophy of History. Le mythe du Jardin d'Éden n'est point une fiction. Il nous donne, sous une forme de l'enfant posé, la première page de l'histoire morale de l'humanité, de cette histoire qui a pour document non plus simplement quelques cellules pour un monter talé, mais toute cette surveillance d'une vie divine dans l'âme humaine, manifesté par ses inspirations et ses dernières, et par cet universel sentiment de la déchéance, qui palpite dans toute la mythologie et les inspirations dominantes de toutes les religions, et de présenter. Der Tempel des Heidentums ist ein Ultrabau, aber ein Bau, der nicht aus dem Heidentum stammt und nicht von den Heiden selbst errichtet ist. Die Mythen Ischeren und Hegel lassen dieses Tempels einteilen ursprünglich die Unschärfe der Welt und des Mengenstellens und der Verhügungen, welche des Members in Angefallen gefallen sind. Lucan. Chapter 1. The bearing of our results on the study of biology and terrestrial physics. How seemed this globe of ours when thou didst scan it? When in thy lusty youth there sprang to birth all that hath life, unnurtured, and the planet was paradise, the true Saturnian earth. Far toward the poles was stretched the happy garden. Earth kept it fair by warmth from her own breast. Toil had not come to dwarf her sons and harden. No crime, there was no want, perturbed their rest. Edmund C. Stedman. The Skull in the Gold Drift. The solution of the problem of life may come from an unexpected quarter. John Fiske. If the alleged facts and the conclusions of the foregoing chapters shall be accepted as correct, it is plain that in finding the true answer to one of the longest standing and most baffling of the problems of biblical theology, we have at the same time found one of those central key truths, acquaintance with which affects a great many other kinds of knowledge. Indeed, it is not too much to say that the acceptance of this alleged truth upon its appropriate evidences must affect men's estimate of the sources of knowledge. For if the sacred traditions of mankind, when once rightly interpreted, are discovered to be in astonishing harmony with each other, and to yield results which our most advanced sciences, working in the most varied fields of research, singularly conspire to verify, this discovery cannot fail to give new significance to history in all its departments and in all its teachings. But apart from this general effect of a verification of ancient testimony, our precise conclusion as to the location of the cradle of the human race has a most evident and important connection with all physical, paleontological, archaeological, philological, mythological, ethnological, and culture-historical speculation. In a word, a most evident and important connection with about every problem which in a marked degree attracts and occupies our modern thought. In the present part, it is proposed to notice the relation of our facts and conclusions to a few of these fields of study, and first of all, in the present chapter, their bearing upon the study of biology and terrestrial physics. In Part 3rd, and in the 7th chapter of Part 5th and elsewhere, we have already had various illustrations of the fascinating and authenticating light which the biological sciences can throw upon the study of prehistoric traditions. Possibly the reader, if devoted to this kind of study, has wondered why a field of illustration so rich has not oftener been utilized by writers upon antiquity. But however important this bearing of biological upon prehistoric studies may be, it should not be forgotten that the counterpart bearing of the study of the earliest traceable thoughts and beliefs of mankind upon biology and upon the most fruitful study of biology is not a whit less important. This is a point of utmost moment to the fields of knowledge concerned, and also to the general theory of personal and organized culture. Yet it is a point most infrequently brought under the consideration of thoughtful readers. It is an unfortunate and ominous fact that the average biologist of the present day sees nothing worthy of his professional attention back to the present century. The intellectual history of the human race has not the slightest interest for him or value for his work. Ages on ages of human observation and thought and speculation touching the problems of life are to him as if they had never been. If he acquaints himself with them in the slightest degree, it is usually only for the sake of amusing his hearers with what he considers the grotesque and absurd ideas of former times, and impressing them with the contrast which latter-day science presents. For all that his race has done until just before his own immediate teachers began, he has little more than pity and contempt. Now, in any department of human learning, such an attitude of mind is certainly to be deplored. Its effects are detrimental in every aspect. Its proportion as it prevails among any class of intellectual workers, in just that proportion does the class become isolated from the one collective and historic intellectual life of humanity. In this way, the collective intellectual life suffers, and yet more do the isolated workers suffer. Humanity, conscious of an intellectual history, naturally comes to pay little attention to these men who deny it, or to take no interest in it. On the other hand, any class of men who ignore the history of the human mind and begin all true history and all true science with their own achievements, by this very procedure place themselves outside that spiritual fellowship in which all forms and fragments of knowledge find unity and mutual supplementing. The circle of their intellectual sympathies and tastes is narrowed. With the loss of broad sympathies and tastes, they are in danger of losing even the capacity to discern and appreciate any kind of truth outside the limited range of their own specialized field of professional research. So far has this perilous tendency already gone that it is a difficult thing in any country to find a celebrated biologist whose publicly advocated theory of education for his own field of labor does not quietly ignore or actively antagonize the broadening historical and humanistic studies which alone can qualify a man for intelligent sympathy with all good learning. Unless the tendency can in some way be checked, there is positive danger lest the special cultivators of biology and the natural sciences become as narrow and isolated and influenceless as a guild of experts as are the antiquarian catalogue makers of modern Europe. In studies like the one which has thus far engaged us lies the best possible corrective for this one-sidedness. In this field are found stimulation for the student's curiosity, facts for his understanding, arguments for his reason, play for his imagination. And all the time his study of nature and his study of man are mutually helpful to each other. He now has nature and her life before him in two forms. First, as she has entombed herself in the great cemetery of the rocks, and secondly, as she has pictured herself in historic and even prehistoric human thought. If the former gives her with greater tangibility, it is only the tangibility of the moldering skeleton. It is the latter which shows her alive and filled with all life's meanings, each as important in its place, both being reciprocally corrective and mutually complementary. As yet the biologist has not profited by ancient conceptions of nature as he should have done. How long and slow has been the progress of the botanist up to this latest conception that all the life forms of the vegetable kingdom proceeded originally from one center, and that of the pole. The ancient Iranian myth of the tree of all seeds, from which proceeded the germs of all species of plants that ever grew, and which, moreover, was located at the North Pole, ought long ago to have suggested to him the truth as to the genetic unity of the vegetable kingdom, and also as to its pristine center of distribution. The same may be said of the zoologist, and the suggestiveness of the myths of the same people respecting the primeval ox, and the Gosh, the personification of the animal kingdom. In these survivals of ancient culture, we have the forms in which the prehistoric zoology expressed the unity, the monogenesis, and the North Polar origin of the entire fauna of the Earth. It is now, perhaps, too late for the biologist to gain from these particular myths the instruction which generations ago they could have given him. By slower and more painful methods, this beautiful polocentric conception of the vegetable, animal, and human worlds has at last been reached. The problems of earliest floral and faunal and ethnic distribution have shut men up to its acceptance. But if the discovery of the accord and significance of these ancient myths has been equally delayed, we may at least indulge the hope that the unexpected agreement of the prehistoric conception with that of latest science will inspire in candid students of nature a new and higher respect for the primeval teachings and beliefs of mankind. Meantime, let it not be forgotten that there are other myths, of equal antiquity and possibly of wider prevalence, that the significance of which for the progress of biology may today be as great as ever was that of the tree of all seeds. Notice, for example, this curious fact, that while in ancient East Aryan thought, the gods on Mount Meru are of prodigious stature, the proper tenants of the adjacent regions are somewhat less, though still gigantic, and they seem to dwindle regularly in size from Varsha to Varsha, until we reach Bharata, the Varsha which borders upon the equatorial ocean and is peopled with ordinary men. And as if the inhabitants of Hades, being still farther to the south, must be, by some law of nature, still smaller than men, Prince Satvayan's soul, when led away to Yama's abode, is described as the Mahabharata as only a thumb in height. A striking gradation, every one will say. Beginning with being sometimes represented as miles in height, it ends on the borders of land and death with disembodied spirits whose stature is only a thumb's length. But this conception of the range of the kingdom and generated and mutable life was not limited to the ancestors of the Hindus. In the most ancient Greek thought, the proper habitat of the Pygmies was near the equatorial ocean river. Farther northward was the abode of men. Still farther proceeding, one came into the region of giants, while in polar Olympos the gods were so colossal that in his fall prostrate Ares covered 7 acres. Traces of the same remarkable adjustment are found in other mythologies. Possibly this far-off prehistoric conception has some significance, some lesson for the biology of today. What should this lesson be, if not that in all our reaches into the origin and sustaining conditions of life, the phenomena of the highest north should be taken into account? Too long have those who busy themselves with these investigations been turning their attention to the ice-cold abysses of the deep sea, hoping in some bathybious clot in the sunless ocean bottom to find the protoplasmic power to which has transmuted inorganic matter into microcosms of organic life. In no such region of cold and darkness should this search be made. Let life's beginnings and life's feeding forces be looked for where its supreme vigor and exuberance have been seen, at the pristine center whence the types and forms of life have spread victoriously through the world. Let them be studied at the pole. On this subject, as conservative an authority as Principal Dawson recently remarked, it is not impossible that the plants of the Creator, the continuous summer sun of the Arctic regions, may have been made the means for the introduction, or at least for the rapid growth and multiplication, of new and more varied types of plants. In this true center, what new and interesting aspects of the problems of life immediately take on? Here we have a regnancy of sunlight such as we never dreamed of in our lower zones. Here we have a tension and direction of terrestrial magnetism with whose biological significance we are utterly unacquainted. Here we have electric forces which pour their currents through every grass blade, and tip the very hills with lambent flame. Shall not such absolutely exceptional biological conditions and energies be found to yield some exceptional biological result? Is this not a more hopeful field for study of the origin of life than the dark and almost congealed recesses of the deep sea? The old theologians were accustomed to call Adam and Eve the protoplasts. In their ancient polar home, it is possible that scientists may yet discover the divine secret of all protoplasm. Again, our new interest in one of the terrestrial polar regions gives fresh significance to the contrasts between the two. Within 10 years, our most eminent American geologist has said, "I find no explanation in the present state of science wherefore most of the dry land of the globe should have been located about the North Pole, and of the water about the South. Physicists say that it indicates greater attraction and therefore a greater density in the solid material beneath the Southern Ocean. But why the mineral ingredients should have been so gathered about the South Pole as to give the crust their greater density is the unanswered query. It may be that the magnetite is much more abundantly diffused through the Antarctic crust than the Arctic. This is only one of many possibilities, and it is at present without a satisfactory fact to stand upon beyond the general truth that iron was universally present. But the diversity of the two poles is as great and as perplexing to the biologist as to the physical geographer. The researchers made show that the two polar regions differ greatly. The seas of the Arctic teem with animal life. Land animals, such as the bear, wolf, reindeer, muskox, and Arctic fox, are scattered over the frozen surface of the land where they find the means of sustenance. The air is peopled with innumerable flocks of birds. A hardy vegetation extends close up to the Arctic Circle, and beyond it, in mosses, lichens, scurvy grasses, sorrel, small stunted shrubs, dwarf trees, and in summer beautiful flowers. In the Antarctic, on the contrary, vegetation ceases at a certain limit, trees terminating at about 56 degrees south latitude. Animal life abounds in the seas, but though birds exist in great numbers and in varieties unknown in the Arctic, no quadrupeds are found upon the land. With this we may compare the already cited language of Sir Joseph Hooker. Geographically speaking, there is no Antarctic flora except a few lichens and seaweeds. Would it not seem as if the South Pole must have been covered by the barren sea at the period when floral and faunal life, starting at its Arctic center, began its conquering marches over all the Earth? Or is there rather some marked difference in the biological value of the poles themselves? But polar biological research involves antecedent polar exploration and a wider and more systematic study of the terrestrial physics. Herein lies a fresh and novel impulse to reinvest on every side of the still uncaptured citadel of the Arctic Pole. Long ago, could Maury write, "As science has advanced, men have looked with deeper and deeper longings toward the mystic circles of the polar regions. There icebergs are framed and glaciers launched. There the tides have their cradle, the whales their nursery. There the winds complete their circuits, and the currents of the sea their round. There the aurora is lighted up, and the trembling needle brought to rest. There, too, in the mazes of that mystic circle, terrestrial forces of occult power and of vast influence upon the well-being of man are continually at play. Within the Arctic Circle is the pole of the winds and the poles of the cold, the pole of the earth and of the magnet. It is a circle of mysteries, and the desire to enter it, to explore its untrodden wastes and secret chambers, and to study its physical aspects has grown into a longing. Noble daring has made Arctic ice and snow-clad seas classic ground. It is no feverish excitement nor vain ambition that leads men there. It is a higher feeling, a holier motive, a desire to look into the works of creation, to comprehend the economy of our planet, and to grow wiser and better by the knowledge. If such a passion for discovery could be kindled in the presence of the older and more abstract problems, what ought to be the result when to these are added the possibility of solving at least some of the mysteries of nature's life, and the certainty of standing where human life began?